Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Annapolis now is the topic for tonight. This refers to Middle East peace talks that took place at the Naval Academy in Annapolis on Tuesday, November 28th of this year. And today, supposedly, there was a meeting for peace in Jerusalem. And we'll be talking about those particular issues. And with us in the studio is George Hudes from Jewish Voice for Peace. Thank you for coming, George. And Ramsis Lutfy, he's co-producer of Holy Land Peace on Olelo, and he's also a retired professor of zoology. Thank you very much for coming. Okay, so we say Annapolis now. Why now?
Well, because it's the most recent in a series of presumed attempts to start the peace process.
Mm-hmm.
And peace process, I think, has been misused lots of times, and lots of people do not sort of have much faith in the results of such a process. But anyway, we can, come up with some ideas about what's happening there, and why there is so much of a gloomy prospect for this initiative this time. I don't know if the sort of prospects are any better than the ones that have been happening before.
Yeah, right.
And that failed.
That's right. And George, what's your take on the process of peace?
Well, I think what Ramsis refers to as the gloomy outlook on the prospects, I would wish that there would be that the convening, or shall we call it the convergence, at Annapolis really did herald a significant new point in an attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it seems like a great show, and I'm not sure that there is really anything significant that has changed in terms of the United States playing a truly more proactive role in terms of seeking peace with justice. It seems that there's been a lot of talk that actually this conference was more about other power politics things in the Middle East, and not really necessarily about Israel and Palestine. I mean, when you have so many nations at the table, including Poland, I mean, it's hard to think we're really getting down to the brass tacks. But I'm sure we'll go into more of that.
Yes, yeah. In fact, Elton Daniel agrees with what we've been saying. I interviewed him the other day for this show, and I asked him, what's happening? What was the impetus for that? So we'll watch Elton Daniels for a couple of minutes, and then we can discuss further.
Number of factors that I think have been speculated about and seem sort of reasonable in that case. In terms of the domestic factors, obviously the United States is beginning to realize that it needs to do various things to try to improve its image in the Arab and the Islamic world in particular. Usually most American administrations figure that out just as a president is leaving office, and this one seems to be following that pattern. But clearly, the troubles in Iraq and other things have brought home to the fact that the Americans have a real image problem in the Middle East and are not seen really as honest brokers in a lot of ways, and they need to repair that image. So you have those kinds of domestic pressures to do something, and Bush is desperately looking for some kind of victory of some kind, or success of some kind to point to before he leaves office. So you have those kinds of factors. Then in terms of the other factors, I suppose the most important ones that appear to me, one is the fact that you have two extraordinarily weak leaders in Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert, both of whom also need a shot in the arm. Olmert's popularity is even less than Bush's in the United States. So they're desperate to be seen as doing something. They probably have very different motives for what they're up to or trying to accomplish, but they both feel the pressure to be seen as active. And then, of course, the main factor that most people bring up for explaining why countries like Saudi Arabia and others finally decided to come along is that they're all motivated by the fear of Iran. That this is the attempt to build some kind of, use this suspicion of what the Iranian government may be up to among conservative Arab governments to really make them think that Israel is the lesser evil, and we throw in with them to stave off the Iranians, and you're basically working out that kind of alliance, trying to detach the Syrians from Iran as well.
Yeah, so I mean, there are other agendas on the table. I mean, that's why there have been a lot of countries involved, states, especially Middle Eastern states. But it's interesting that, as you said, Poland is there. It never was Middle Eastern, not even with its contingent of troops in Iraq. But so what I want to do is I asked Elton also about why did Syria join in? I mean, especially because there's, Syria has a position as regards the Golan Heights and so forth. So if it's okay, we can play that segment, just less than a minute, and then we can discuss things further.
May partly be fear of what would happen if they didn't join in. It may have been to help keep an eye on things. Nobody sells the farm while they're not looking. And just to remind people that the Golan Heights issue is still out there. And there have been all these stories that in fact the basic framework for settlement between Israel and Syria has been worked out, and the problem has been that the U.S. administration has been blocking it, aided by some elements in Israel itself that don't want to see it. But now, of course, they have this idea that, well, you need to isolate Iran and separate it from its allies. They probably offered various inducements to Syria to help persuade it to come along as well. So again, it's probably a complex, set of motives that they have.
Yeah, I mean, Ramsis, you heard what Elton was talking about in terms of Syria, why Syria, etc. But also, do you agree with him on the earlier issue, although, along the lines that we were talking about?
Yes, of course, all the participants are coming to this with different, as he said, with different kind of interests in it, and of course, partly many of them are being dragged by the United States, which wanted to, the U.S. wanted to make it an international sort of occasion to attract attention to this. But actually, it is more of the same. What has, has happened that changed the position of the United States, nor Israel for that matter? So where are the core issues that are causing the the peace process hasn't been budging at all for so many years? And there were many peace processes before that. And we saw how they ended. There was Madrid, and there was Oslo, and there was the Camp David, and all these great occasions and conferences, and nothing happens. And the core issues are left always to the last minute. And that's because Israel doesn't want to touch these things. One very important thing here is that the quartet didn't appear in this last conference as a main participant. So I feel that the quartet is being excluded. And of course, this is...
So could you explain to our viewers
the four large sort of conglomerations, the European Union, Russia, United Nations, and the United States, who had adopted what is called the roadmap. And the roadmap, of course, was staggering all the way. Nothing has it sort of materialized from it. And Israel, to start with, said, we accepted, but they had 14 or 15 objections to it.
Yeah.
And they never really were enthusiastic about it and didn't want to.
Yeah.
So you find here that Israel actually doesn't want peace except on its own terms.
Yeah.
And her own terms are Eretz Israel, the Zionist project, which is one main state, one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And if the Palestinians accept Israel's conditions and accept to live in a non-state, in a group of cantons or Bantustans under the daily sort of pressure of Israeli occupation or sort of hemming in of Palestine, a non-state actually. That's what Israel wants, is Palestinian.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you, George, about the infrastructure for having a two-state solution that George Bush has been talking about for a long time, and especially, in announcing the Annapolis Conference. What can you say about the infrastructure for a two-state solution?
Oh, there's so many ways of approaching this, but the way things are right now, more and more people agree that a two-state solution is increasingly impossible. There's no indication that Israel is truly willing to withdraw its settlements. It hasn't even begun to withdraw its outposts, and almost all of the outposts and many of the settlements are illegal even under Israeli law. We still have 500 checkpoints. We have the approximately 11 or 12% of what was once Israel, or approximately 50% of the so-called occupied territories that Palestinians still control. I mean, it's completely split up, fractured. Israel has taken the best water resources. And so on the one hand, we have groups of Palestinians backed by some international capital who announced that they are willing to make significant investments in a Palestinian economy. But those investments remain non-viable so long as you have a situation where there is no country there, so to speak, and while Israel still can run rampant over the lives of Palestinians at any moment, come in and destroy the infrastructure, which Israel has done. I mean, every time that the Palestinians started building infrastructure, Israel found a reason, whether it was the Intifada or another terrorist attack, which has a context, Israel found an excuse to come in and not just put down the so-called violence, but wreak a kind of violence and havoc that just was clearly designed to destroy any infrastructure that could make a Palestinian political entity or economic entity impossible. Exactly. So nothing has really changed. Indeed, we find that while these quote-unquote peace negotiations are starting, Israel continues to appropriate money for expansion of the settlements. They have not withdrawn one outpost. They announce plans to withdraw, but this is an old pattern. On the other hand, there's no inclusion of Hamas, and Hamas is a reality in Palestine. Now they say, well, they're terrorists. Well, if you look at some of the Jewish zealot organizations in Israel, they're also terrorists by almost any definition of the term. But they are part of the government, they're included. On the Palestinian, no. And the PLO is not represented. And the PLO according to international precedent, is the legal representative of the Palestinian people. So you would have neither the previously declared legal representative of the Palestinian people even represented at the talks, and you don't have the elected government of the Palestinians represented at the talks. There are problems in that elected government. One of the big problems is that a significant percentage of them are in Israeli prisons, as are, thousands of other Palestinians.
10,000, 11,000, yeah.
So I think the skepticism, I mean, I know nobody who doesn't dream of peace. But the skepticism, I think, is due to the fact that we see no significant change in that could actually reverse the history of the past 10 to 15 years, at the very least, that has increasingly made a separate Palestinian state an impossibility. We see no movements towards including really all of the Palestinian people, so that whatever is finally come up with will really, if we could come up with anything, would have duration, would have credibility, would represent the full faith and credit of all parties. So it starts out almost as a recipe for disaster with so many sideshows.
Yes. And here I want to go to Elton, Daniel. He's talking about why certain Arab governments have been dealing with that. So we'll go to Elton, and we take it from there.
Certain Arab governments may now be feeling much more inclined to resume some kind of talks with the Israelis, because governments like the Saudis and others are really feeling the heat from popular dissatisfaction and unhappiness. And they're not only worried about, just the possibility of the spreading influence of Iran and Shiism, they're worried about dissent within their own governments. That the issue in Palestine, it's always been this sort of kind of festering sore that won't go away and stirs up problems in all sorts of other places, and that things might be getting out of control. And so simply out of a sense of self-preservation, they want to try to deal that, and they're willing to compromise. But my feeling would be, if that's the case, they're not exactly helping themselves, because to be seen as actively colluding with the Israelis, even if it's actively colluding with them against the Iranians as opposed to the interests of the Palestinians and the Arabs, I mean, I can't imagine that public opinion is going to buy the argument that it's more important to be friends with Israel and the United States than it is to maintain some kind of Arab solidarity and support for the Palestinians. That to me looks like it would actually make it less popular to do that.
Yeah, and I also, we were talking in the interview, it's not part of the segments that we have, is that, is this sustainable? It's something along the lines you were talking about. These kinds of talks are not really sustainable for any number of reasons, including that the impetus for the Arab states to go into negotiations actually is self-defeating, because the people in Saudi Arabia, all over the Arab world, and even beyond, would look at these guys, why you want to go and have peace with Israel or some kind of agreements with Israel, while the Palestinian national rights and human rights are remain violated by the Israelis with support from the United States. So there's a problem here.
I think if the pressure were really on Israel from the United States and other countries to come up with a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict along the lines of the proposal of the Arab League, then it might not necessarily be that type of collusion. In other words, return all of the land taken from 1967, including parts of Jerusalem that were taken, a recognition of the right of return. The same things that have been on the table for a long, long
since time immemorial.
So, and that was the position of the Arab League.
Right.
And even the Geneva Accords, to a certain extent, recognize that that these are the things that have to be addressed. There may be some creativity in addressing them, but these principles have to be the bottom
core
line.
problems, yes.
And so that, I think, if we saw a movement in that direction, I think it's conceivable that the Arab governments that are participating might not be seen as acting against the interests of their own people, whether it be the Arab world or the Muslim world, or however one might phrase this. But we don't see any of that.
Yeah.
Indeed, we don't see any statement from our own government which has, if anything, prolonged the conflict through its unquestioning support of Israel. There's nothing to indicate that type of direction might be taken. So
Yeah, right. And yeah, go ahead, Ramsis.
Well, the only thing that I sort of can think of is that when Bush made his speech, he said that we have learned to bring down our expectations. What are the expectations of the United States? We know quite well that the expectations of the United States nearly the same as those of Israel. But I think that he made this comment or this remark to bring down the expectation of the Palestinians. And I expect that the whole staged thing is to put pressure and more pressure and more pressure to bring the Palestinian Authority or the leadership of the Palestinians, in particular Abbas, to give more than anybody had accepted to give before. Of course, Arafat tried to do this, and he walked into a trap. And when he woke up from his being in this entrapment, he said, no, I can't go any further. So he was turned back into the terrorist that he had been before. So this is what's going to happen. They are going to press Abbas more and more to milk him more, but eventually he will not be able to. The same thing is going to happen, and he say, no, I'll give up. So he'll become a terrorist again.
Right. Yeah, I mean, or they would brand him.
Yes, of
terrorist.
course.
They would call him a
Of
terrorist,
course.
Yeah. But it's interesting that something you mentioned earlier is that the quartet is not there.
Yeah.
So one would wonder what sideshow there might be as regards the U.S. trying to isolate not only the European Union, but the Russian Federation state, and others, and try to say, okay, now the Arab governments are dealing with this, so forget about the United Nations, forget about the Russians, and we are dealing now.
Yeah.
So how does that sound to you, any one of you?
Isolation, because every time, I think this is one of the most important points. The Israelis are always keen on pressing, on putting pressure because, for example, all the United Nations resolutions were the core issues that we were talking about: right of return,
Jerusalem,
Jerusalem, settlement, stop
water,
settlement, and all these things. And obviously, these are on the table, and they have been they passed the resolutions for that. So there's nothing new, except that Israel keeps saying peace process.
Right.
Yes, and it connects it with what? With its security. And I don't see how the Palestinian people who are victimized and occupied can guarantee the security of Israel, which is their victimizer and occupier. How can a colonialist power ask the colonized people to sort of make sure that the colonizer are secure?
Yeah.
That's impossible.
And how can you have negotiations on an equal footing when that
Asymmetry,
land is occupied by the forces of the
of
the people who want to deal with you on a particular quote-unquote solution? But the other thing, I asked Elton, in terms of isolating Syria or isolating Iran by moving Syria away from Iran, so to speak, That would be one thing. But also, if this is going to fail, that's what we have been talking about, who is advising the United States administration on this thing? So I asked him about that. So let's see what he has to say, and then we'll comment on that.
Because you're talking about an administration that has in it, let's say, Condoleezza Rice on the one hand, who wants to, has this sort of naive idea about being a peacemaker and all of this stuff and pushing this agenda and hoping diplomacy can work and this kind of thing. But Elliott Abrams is also in this administration. And Elliott Abrams, was notorious for doing everything he could to sabotage the Oslo Accords and process. I don't think he's going to be cheerleading for a settlement. I think mostly they're just throwing up a smoke screen to make it look like Bush is doing something and hope that it somehow, tampers things down in various countries. And there's also the possibility, you're exactly right, there is no policy. These are just people who are floundering around in the hope that lightning is going to strike and something is going to happen.
Yeah, like wishful thinking. Maybe we'll do something and then voila, something appears.
Excuse me, Bush is not famous for seeking the good advice from anybody that can give him good advice.
Right.
I mean, it's notorious about that.
Absolutely.
I would agree very much with his comment that I think it's a show. It's some sort of dance that has no substance to it. I mean, almost everybody who came to this party didn't want to come.
Yeah, right.
Israel didn't really want to come.
They dragged him.
Maybe Abbas wanted to come because he's so pathetically weak and he has nothing else.
Yeah.
Syria didn't really want to come. Saudi Arabia didn't really want to come. I mean, who wanted to come? And even within the Bush administration, you have these countervailing forces, these different the different camps, the Cheney camp, the Rice camp.
Sects,
I mean, it's so it's like, well, let's get everybody in one room, and let's not try not to have any embarrassing moments, and then everybody will go home, and we'll call the peace process. We're continuing to meet. And of course, it probably is also a last gasp by a totally failed domestic administration here in the United States. So they'll be able to claim, well, we brought all the parties together and we restarted the peace process on a different basis and of course there was diplomacy involved because we brought so many countries in, but as Ramsis points out, what happened to the quartet? What kind of diplomacy? This is the United States using a little muscle to create a show, but not really to produce any results.
Yeah, the French ambassador to the United Nations on the eve of the Annapolis Conference on Charlie Rose asked him, why is it Annapolis only one day, not two? He laughed. He said, because then they will start disagreeing.
Yes.
Did you see that?
I mean, they got there, they had jet lag for 24 hours, and then they went home.
Yeah,
I mean,
they just kind of relaxed.
And there will be, we know, I mean, the historical pattern will not change. The Israelis will, it is so easy for them to either find or to generate an excuse to say, we're not going to talk to these people there, because a rocket comes into Sderot, or because there's, an Israeli soldier is kidnapped, or something. I mean, which, so long as they're an occupying power, these things will continue.
Yeah,
so it becomes
in fact, in terms of settlements, etc., more Jewish settlers went into Arab East Jerusalem after the Annapolis thing.
Yes.
I mean, come on, if you're really serious about peace, why would you want to aggravate the situation?
And we now have more, if you count all the settlers that were removed from Gaza, there are now a larger number in the West Bank occupied territories. Yeah. So, and this goes on unabated, but as I think, what's his name? Elton very well indicates, there are so many different agendas here, whether it's domestic U.S., domestic Israeli, domestic Palestinian, domestic Saudi Arabian, Syrian,
Yes,
Egyptian.
yes, yes.
I mean, there's so many different
Yes,
agendas running.
splintered, yeah.
Yeah, don't keep them more than a day because all of this will come out.
Yes, yeah. So it is, I mean, it's tragic. We are laughing because, you know, tragedy makes
it is
one,
tragic.
one laugh.
How come that Gaza was not mentioned in the whole thing?
Well, there you go.
Yes.
Because, you know, it's like, well, you can have the the West Bank
an
or
enemy
part of
entity,
it.
yeah.
Part of it. And then Gaza, if you want it, you know, or if you can have it. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
You know, that kind of stuff.
I mean,
In
even in Israel, if you read the liberal press
Yeah.
in Israel, I mean, it's a laughing matter.
Right.
The whole thing is a laughing matter. So
And if you think that Israel is going to need any pretext,
Yeah.
it doesn't need. They attacked Gaza yesterday and they killed 8 people, of course, on the pretext that they are terrorists or something. And I mean, who's terrorist and who is not terrorist in this situation? Nobody knows. So they bombard and they go in with tanks and up till now. So Gaza is actually nothing was a big concentration camp.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and then the question, just to mention that the question about Israeli really destroying infrastructure for not only a Palestinian state but for Palestinian society has been documented by, for instance, for Gaza by Sarah Roy, you know, who's a researcher at Harvard and so on, and she's Jewish. Her parents
she's
are
a very
Holocaust
excellent scholar,
advisors,
very good scholar, very
and
good scholar.
I mean, Holocaust survivors, and she really documented that, and she was aided by Israelis of conscience who really didn't want that situation to continue.
There's a very excellent discussion that I've referred many people to that I think enters into this picture, and it was a discussion between Finkelstein and Ben Ami, who was the Shlomo Ben Ami under the who was the foreign minister of Israel under Barak, when we almost supposedly had the peace agreement until the Israelis pulled out at the follow-up. And in this discussion, Finkelstein continuously points out the international laws that are being broken by Israel. And Ben Ami and Finkelstein largely agree on their perspective of history. But Ben Ami focuses more on power relationships than legal relationships. And I think what we're seeing in the Annapolis now, or was it Annapolis yesterday, or what we're seeing is a display of power. But I don't think we will have any follow-up in terms of, you know, starting to enact and apply the principles of international law to the situation in Palestine and Israel, because Israel remains powerful, and I think there's an attitude there that until the Palestinians come to us on their knees, we will make them suffer more, and we will make them suffer more,
and squeeze,
and we will make them suffer more. So that I don't think anything has changed in this equation.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, the title Annapolis Now, you know, reminded me of Apocalypse Now, because, you know, for the Palestinians, it's apocalyptic. I mean, they're losing a lot of stuff. Like Edward Said, the late Edward Said, was saying when he was invited to the Rose Garden for the signing of the Oslo, he declined by saying, this is the final dispossession of the Palestinian people. Why would you want me to come and you know, celebrate? There's nothing to celebrate, because it is like another catastrophe, another apocalypse for the Palestinians. And but the thing is that if one looks at the larger picture, and we've been you know, discussing around that particular topic. I mean, if we look at the larger picture, and we look at, for instance, what's happening in Iran, in Lebanon, and we brought Syria into the picture here, and in the larger Middle East, and how that kind of situation, Annapolis and the aftermath of Annapolis, might factor into the U.S. strategy or geostrategy in the Middle East, given its larger global strategy. One might begin to see that you know, things begin to fit perhaps in terms of you know, the Bush administration. ideas about, power relations in the Middle East and so on. So for that, I want to go to Elton Daniel again, and we were talking about the National Intelligence Estimate as regards the attack or,
nuclear ambitions of
potential attack against Iran and so on. So we'll go to that, and then it's going to generate a lot more discussion and broaden the topic.
Okay.
No, the release of that national intelligence estimate, which is, of course, the big story these days, where our own intelligence agencies say that whatever weapons program there was abandoned in 2003, and they seem very certain of that on the kind of information that whatever it is they have to work with. And they've admitted that there's no way Iran, even if it was trying to, it couldn't have a bomb until 2012 or something like that. And it's really pulled the rug out from under the talk about World War III and stuff that Bush was dealing with earlier. That sort of suggested two things in my mind. I mean, what it convinced me of, I had no doubts all along that Iran was getting a very bad rap in this issue. It removed any doubt I had that this Bush crowd was planning to attack Iran. My timeline for it would have been sometime between probably April and June. In large part to create a kind of sense of panic that would shape the next election in the U.S. I'm not quite convinced Cheney is as disinterested in being president as he pretends to be, and I could sort of see the scenario where you have, we're in the middle of this huge international crisis and conflict, and we can't have a change of leadership now, and so Cheney comes to save things this way. Whatever the agenda may be, I really have no doubt after the reaction that they had to this report that that's what they were planning to do. And I think I agree with some of the speculation that the people who released that report made a coup of their own, that you basically have intelligence agents and people in the military who are not going to allow the public to be duped the way they were with Iraq, and so they made this public to nip that project in the bud. The rhetoric coming from Bush is still war.
Even
threat,
after
threat, even after the report. I mean, they're actually trying now to, the fact that they were so wrong about Iraq now means they're wrong about this. The people that manipulated and disguised all of that information. I mean, the cynicism of it boggles the mind, the kind of arguments. They have a report that essentially exonerates Iran, makes it guilty. You also have the irony, of course, of this happening at the very time these documents from the Nixon administration are being released, showing that the Nixon administration was all worried about the Israeli nuclear program and what to do about it, which the Iranians have, missed no opportunity to point out as well.
Yeah, it's interesting about the Israeli nuclear program and Nixon because, the French were the ones who have supplied the Israelis with the nuclear technology, etc. And of course, the U.S. didn't want France to have like a major role in the Middle East via Israel. So there was that kind of a problem there. But it's interesting how Elton relates the domestic with the international, at least in terms of the Middle East issue. So any comments, George?
I think Elton phrases it probably better than I could. It's in terms of how all of this reflects on Annapolis. It's a very sad joke, I think, because there are many people who suffer tremendously every day in the Middle East, who would love, who pray every day, who dream every day of just some stability in their lives, of an end to this continuing terror.
The perpetual war.
And so they say, and so when many people are interviewed, they say, well, they hope something comes of this, but that's all they have left. But in terms of really giving credibility to this process, all of the things that Elton talks about they're all there. I mean, from the internal politics of the U.S., the internal politics of Israel, the internal politics of Palestine, the dynamics of the Middle East. I mean, where you have, a great power like Iran, a historically great power like Iran, that is going to be a major player, but you have all kinds of ruthless regimes in the Middle Eastern world that have been put into power to some extent and supported by the United States because that's our game. I mean, whenever a popular regime has come into power, a democratic regime, that threatens to look after itself more than U.S. interests, we've managed to push them out. So we support these autocratic regimes. And it's a power politics game. There are power politics struggles within our own administration. And so they invited everybody to the party for one day, and they had toasts, and everybody said, we're here, okay, we came, you forced us to come, now we're going home, and we'll sit down and talk once in a while. So today they had they don't even have a process. They're trying to agree on a process.
Yeah, but also it's interesting, like the release of the National Intelligence Estimate really put a monkey wrench in those things. But before the release, you have Annapolis, and then you have plans to attack Iran.
Yes.
So how can you have peace in the Middle East in terms of Israel, Palestine, and with the rest of the Arabs while you are attacking Iran? Do you think like Iran is so...
It's a charade.
The
whole thing is just a
separated?
cover-up, as if it is a diversive tactic. This business of Annapolis.
Right.
I mean, it's a minor thing. Let people think about it, but we have a stronger
other plans,
aim and a much more
so it's camouflage,
geopolitical
perhaps.
aim. Exactly. So diversion, that's all. That's how I see it.
Yeah, because I mean, it doesn't make sense if you want to have like peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, assuming everything is just, etc., and while at the same time you're attacking Iran. It's you think like Iran is not part of that world? Absolutely.
But what we mentioned before about the different factions in the Bush administration itself, it could be sort of contradictions between these factions, and some of them are coming out with something to foil the other group's attempts.
So some of them are military people. I mean, But anyway, what I want to do now is go back to Elton and see how like these kinds of issues that we've been talking about began to change the political dynamic, especially after the release of the National Intelligence Estimate.
He's got a very changed political dynamics now to deal with, and I mean that's just part of it, because it's not only Fallon or these other people who are making comments. I mean, now he has General Sanchez basically saying your project in Iraq is a disaster. I mean, they have defections all over. That's what I think a lot of people in this field have been looking for, is that ultimately the way the dynamics are in this country, the way politics works in this country, is it really needs to be people in the military who come forward and let the public know that you're being misled and we're not going to be used this way again.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, this is interesting, the National Intelligence Estimate, and that was a monkey wrench in Bush's plans and so forth. But before we go to discussing this, I understand we have a caller on the line? No? Oh, no more. Okay. So the caller vanished, so to speak. So let's go with that.
Let me just offer one thing. I mean, I think part of what we might be seeing with the end of the Bush era approaching, it can't come fast enough. But I think there may be more people in different places in the administration who now feel safer to say what they really think. They want to separate themselves. The rats are jumping from the burning ships. And I think what we've seen here is perhaps people in the military and the Foreign Service, the intelligence agencies who we know that many of them have been aghast for the last several years at what our administration has been doing, have thought very different about many things, that now they perhaps feel there is license, it is safe for them to come out and perhaps avert another type of disaster that could lead to another war that could prolong the same types of people in power. So I think they are themselves hoping for, wishing for a change in direction of our own government. And I think that this is what's going on.
Okay, we have a caller came back online, right? Swiss from Waimanalo. You're on the air.
Good evening. I'm very interested in what you're discussing. And I think the topic of what the Bush administration is getting away with is it's almost overdone. I mean, he's more Teflon than our most Teflon president ever. So I wonder if I could ask if you could address something I know I'm not too familiar with, and that is the standing of Iran in the Arab world and how much this kind of incident could withdraw the support for, particularly for military occupation of not just Iraq, but Saudi Arabia. And the other influences that this administration has pushed.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, mahalo.
Yeah. Thank you. It's interesting. Iran's influence or position in the Arab world. Just to clarify, Iran is part of the region. It's not Arab. It's Muslim, Shia Muslim majority. It has its own culture, history, civilization, whatsoever. But the ties between Iran and the Arab world are long-standing from like hundreds and hundreds of years. And when I hear Bush complaining about Iran intervening in Iraq, and he's complaining about this, he doesn't say anything about the occupation itself, the U.S. occupation
What's
of
he
Iran,
doing there?
which is fascinating. If the U.S. has national interests in the Middle East, can you imagine that Iran does not have any national interest in the region that it resides? So it's really fascinating. So the other thing one might say as regards to the Iraq situation, the government, the Iraqi government now, is very friendly, and the people in it are very friendly with Iran, and some of them spent years there. So Iran has a direct and indirect influence there. If the U.S. really wants to solve the Iraqi situation,
Has to sit with
Iran, but they don't want to do that. They want to bomb them instead, and this way Iran would vanish. But more on that, perhaps.
There is one point that I'm really worried. What Elton mentioned here is with the approach of the end of the Bush administration's sort of term in office.
Right.
They are going to be desperate to try and get a Republican to be elected.
Yes.
And this by showing the macho figure. We can defend America's interests and defend the world and impose democracy and all that kind of thing. That's very frightening because at the same time we see the privatization of war.
Absolutely. Blackwater and the rest of the Dynacorp and all that.
And these have their own forces now.
Right.
When is the time that the situation inside America is going to be attractive for whoever is in power to enforce their will by force?
You raise a very important point.
It's frightening.
Right. Yeah, it is. That's interesting. I want to go back to Elton again, and we will be talking about. I asked him about the surge and all that because it's important in the larger strategy that the United States have, whether the surge really has, worked or not. So we'll do that and then come back to the discussion.
the interpretation I would place on a lot of this is that, at least in Baghdad, the level of violence has probably dropped, and the number of American casualties has dropped. That could be simply because a lot of groups are biding their time and laying low and not making trouble until later on. There are a lot of reasons why it could happen. The other thing I sort of deduce from this is that the various groups in Iraq have now basically concluded that the United States has been defeated. And they want to get the best possible terms for position for themselves to be in when the now inevitable American withdrawal takes place. So much of the most touted success of what supposedly happened has come about because of groups that used to be part of the insurgency now using cooperation with the Americans in order to get weapons and other material to use against their internal adversaries there. So groups, are lining themselves from a purely pragmatic, self-interested point of view temporarily with the United States in order to improve their position later on. In other words, a lot of what looks like the progress is misleading. It pops up in other places. It can easily come back from some other quarter. And what you may have done with the successes that you've had in the surge is to simply arm people for a much fiercer civil war than you had before.
Yeah, very interesting here. And, in terms of Saudi Arabia being afraid of the rise of Shiism, but because Saudi Arabia has a Shia population itself in a place that really matters, where the oil is.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the eastern part of that. So there's all that thing going on, and shows the relationship actually between Saudi Arabia and the United States on the one hand, and the question of Iran and its influence not only in Iraq but elsewhere in the region, including Lebanon through Hezbollah and so forth. Yeah. But that actually speaks to the question of, if you really want to make peace, you drag those Arabs into Annapolis on the one hand, but knowing that nothing is going to come out of it, so that you can create this kind of division in Iran and the rest of the Arabs. So it becomes like Arab versus Iranian, as opposed to Iran, Syria on one hand, and some of the other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. on the other. Yeah. I didn't want to say Jordan because for practical purposes.
I think by any criteria, that's an almost for the United States to believe that they could choreograph the event of Annapolis and any follow-up that well, I think is beyond credibility.
Right. Yeah.
Because, and of course, we're skimming over an awful lot of Middle East politics and history here.
Yes.
There is so much complexity, and we could go country by country and spend days on each country. But it is a very, very complex area. All of the parties have unquestionable vested interests, and the idea that the United States could bring everybody to Annapolis and begin sawing through the Gordian knot by simply saying, "Okay, go to work, you guys," is ludicrous. And everything that Elton points to in terms of all of the different agendas.
One of the major sort of elements in this case is the relation between the ruling cliques in the Middle Eastern countries and their street.
Yes.
Which is, making them sort of try always and do a balancing act.
Yeah, which actually, in times of resistance to those kinds of policies, the street will become a boulevard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's more people there, and we've seen that in the Iranian Revolution happening, etc. I want to bring it back in a more direct way to the question of Palestine, etc., by going back to Elton, who talks about Abbas as America's stooge. We'll see that.
I mean, he's already got this huge albatross around him, and he looks absolutely like an American stooge.
Right.
And does whatever the Americans and the Israelis tell him to. How he could sell anything less than a wonderful, wonderful deal to the Palestinians, I just don't see how he could bring it off. The United States is rapidly losing the ability to impose a solution. I mean, I think there was a time when the United States could have said, okay, you know, Israelis, you basically won this struggle. Now's the time for you to be magnanimous. Here's what you have to give up. Here's what you have to do to have a settlement, and the Israelis really wouldn't have had much choice to go along. But now we've built them up to the point that they're power in their own right, and they are supremely confident, of course, that if they ever had a president that tried to impose a settlement on them that they didn't want, they could stifle it in Congress, they could do whatever else they wanted to do. I don't think the U.S. has that capacity anymore.
Yeah, and this, like, we've been talking about this. I mean, it's a charade.
Yes,
it's
yeah.
like bogus kind of thing. But who are they trying to convince that it is true and that it's going to work this time? For instance, this Israeli researcher, Leon Hadar, he's also a journalist, I think. And now he is in one of the think tanks in the United States. I'm not sure which one, maybe the American Enterprise Institute or some Middle East kind of institute. He says in a week ago or so in an article that actually finally the Arabs have agreed to come to Annapolis and sit and talk peace. He completely dismisses the Fahd plan of 1981. He dismisses the Arab League plan, which is actually, you know, the Fahd plan again.
Yes, it is the Fahd plan.
Of 2002.
Yeah.
And that the Arabs have been ready to talk peace with Israel in a long time. He completely dismisses this. One wonders whether he's honest or he has amnesia, you know.
Both.
Or dishonest. I mean, dishonest,
yes.
or
Both dishonest
has
and amnesic, yeah.
And amnesia. I mean, what is it? I mean, can't he, like, has he no shame to talk this way and just not mentioning the, you know, the Arabs' peace negotiations and peace deals that they offer the Israelis?
Shame is a rare commodity.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
Anything associated with the
Exactly.
United States government, unfortunately.
How
today.
many? I mean, you can count those who are really honest and genuine about their analyses of what's happening in the Middle East.
Right.
And it's not surprising to see such claims anymore.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the people of the Middle East suffer, and we are here just discussing it, hopefully, and to try and bring out more awareness about this particular issue, so we can, like, pressure our own government here to not support Israel blindly, but be impartial to the thing. So we are out of time. Thank our viewers, and thank you very much, and see you next year.
Thank you.
Happy New
Next
Year.
year,
Merry
right.
Christmas too. All right.
Thank you.